Francis Turretin, the One and Triune God, 12th question, the knowledge of God. Do all things fall under the knowledge of God, both singulars and future contingencies? We affirm against Socinus. Among the communicable and positive attributes which affirm some perfection of God, there are three principal ones by which his immortal and perfectly happy life is active: intellect, will, and power. The first belongs to the principle as directing, the second as enjoining, the third as executing. Concerning the intellect of God and the disquisition of his knowledge, two things above all others must be attended to: the mode and object. The mode consists in his knowing all things perfectly, undividedly, distinctly, and immutably. It is thus distinguished from human and angelic knowledge perfectly, because he knows all things by himself or by his essence, not by forms abstracted from things, as is the case with creatures, both because these are only in time with the things themselves, but the knowledge of God is eternal, and because he can have no cause out of himself. 2. Undividedly, because he knows all things intuitively and noetically, not discursively and dianoetically, by ratiocination and by inferring one thing from another. If God is sometimes set forth as inquiring or reasoning, this is not said properly but humanly, the Scriptures lisping with us to the perfect and certain knowledge of God. 3. Distinctly, not that by a diverse conception he collects diverse predicates of things, but because he most distinctively sees through all things at one glance, so that nothing, even the most minute, can escape him. 4. Immutably, because with him there is no shadow of change, and as he himself, remaining immovable, gives motion to all, so he sees the various turns and changes of things by an immutable cognition. The object of the knowledge of God is both himself, who most perfectly knows himself in himself, and all things extrinsic to him, whether possible or future, i.e., as to their various orders and states, as to quantity, great and small, as to quality, good and bad, as to predication, universals and singulars, as to time, past, present, and future, as to state, necessary and free or contingent. Whether God knows singulars. The principal question agitated here is that about singulars and future contingent things, which some wish to withdraw from the knowledge of God. Singulars, indeed, as Averroes, who denies that they can be exactly known by God. This is also charged upon Jerome, since he thinks it to be absurd and unworthy of the divine majesty to let it down to this, that it should know how many gnats are born or die every moment, number of cinches and fleas on earth. This opinion is highly injurious towards God. It is if precisely urged, but these rather harsh words can be softened and understood comparatively. They mean nothing else than to withdraw these things from the special care exercised towards men, to teach their advantage over them. Jerome seems to intimate this by adding, quote, "Nor are we such foolish flatterers of God, as while drawing down his power to the lowest things, to be injurious to ourselves, teaching that the same providence extends to irrational as to rational creatures," end quote. Indeed, Scripture is so clear on this subject as to leave no room for doubt. For why should Christ say that the hairs of our head are all numbered, and not one sparrow can fall on the ground without the will of the Father? Matthew 10:29 and 30. How could Paul assert that all things are naked and opened unto him, and there is no creature that is not manifest in his sight? Hebrews 4:13. How could the psalmist intimate that God tells the number of the stars and calls them all by their names? Psalm 147:4, unless God beheld individual things. And if God created and governs them, why should he not also know them? The divine understanding is no more debased by the knowledge of a mean thing than the sun is polluted by a filthy thing. And if the power of God was not lowered when he created them, why should his knowledge be debased by the contemplation of them? Yea, since all things, even the greatest, are the smallest before him in comparison with his infinity, as Isaiah 40:15 magnificently says, and as it were nothing, the knowledge of all things should be denied of him if the smallest are removed from his notice. Statement of the question, the knowledge of future contingent things. Another question of greater importance refers to future contingent things, the knowledge of which the Socinians endeavor to wrest from God in order to establish more easily the indifference of free will, its freedom from all necessity, even from that which is usually placed upon it by the foreknowledge of God. They may sometimes seem to attribute to him a full knowledge of all things, even of those which are future. Quote, under the name of the wisdom of God, in this place we embrace the knowledge of all things, end quote. And a little after, quote, as to future things, there are the most palpable proofs in Scripture that God knows them also. This is Crellius, end quote. Yet elsewhere they openly withdraw from him the knowledge of future contingencies as not being in the class of knowable things, saying either that he does not know them absolutely or only indeterminately and probably. Socinus says, quote, since then there is no reason, no passage of Scripture from which it can be clearly gathered that God knew all things which happened before they happened, we must conclude that we are by no means to assert such a foreknowledge of God, especially when both many reasons and sound testimony are not wanting, utterly opposed to it, end quote. So to Crellius, quote, they act inconsiderately who say that God knows determinately future contingencies, because otherwise he would not be omniscient. Since the rasher, therefore, he cannot conceive future things determinately because he is omniscient and never errs in this that can be known, end quote. And Smalcius, in opposition to Francius, still more clearly, quote, but how can that be true which destroys itself and is repugnant to the Scriptures or does great violence to them? To say that God knows those things which are in no manner, such as future contingencies are, is to contradict himself. For what is knowable is not properly contingent, and what is properly contingent cannot be known, end quote. On the other hand, the Orthodox maintain that future contingent things fall under the infallible foreknowledge of God. On the state of the question, observe, 1, that a thing may be contingent in two ways, either with respect to the first cause, inasmuch as it can be produced or not produced by God, and so all creatures are contingent with respect to God because he might not have created any if he had so willed, or with respect to second cause, which can produce or not produce their effect, and are thus distinguished from necessary causes. We here speak of future contingents in the latter and not in the former sense. 2. A thing can be considered either as to the certainty of event or as to the mode of production. A future contingent thing implies both, for as future it signifies the certainty of event, but as contingent the mode of production. It has the former from the decree of the first cause, the latter from the constitution of the second cause. Thus the question is whether things, not any whatsoever and having a necessary cause, for there is no doubt as to these, but contingent, which have a free cause, and indifferent, adiaphoron, not logically as to the first cause, in which sense even the most necessary things are contingent, since they can be and not be, but physically, as to the contingent second cause, fall under the infallible knowledge of God, not as knowing them only indeterminately and probably, but determinately and most certainly. This the Socinians deny, we affirm. The reasons are, 1, Scripture frequently claims such knowledge of God. Lord, thou knowest all things. John 21:17. And God is greater than our heart and knoweth all things. 1 John 3:20. The objection is fruitless that, quote, all things refers to all knowable things and that future contingencies are not such. This is the proton pseudos, a thing to be proved, not taken for granted. However, we say they are knowable not in themselves determinately, but in the decree of God. Quote, known unto God, says James, are all his works from the beginning of the world. Acts 15:18. If all works, therefore, also the free and contingent. If known from eternity, therefore also the future. Nor ought it to be said, A, that the reference here is not to every work of God or of men, but to that of which James was speaking, the calling of Gentiles. For the universal mark admits of no restriction, but shows that James proceeded from the genus to the species, from the thesis to the hypothesis in this sense. Whatever God does in time, he decreed and foreknew from eternity. Therefore he decreed and foreknew that the Gentiles would be introduced into the communion of the church without an observance of the Mosaic law. B. That it refers to the works which are, and not to those which neither have been, nor are, nor certainly will be, such as future contingencies are. For although they are not as to real being, yet they are as to known being. Although they will not certainly be as to second causes, yet they will certainly be as to the first, by which they are defined. C. The calling of the Gentiles was so a work of God, that it ought also to be the work of the nations, because they ought to respond to his call through grace. Therefore, if God certainly knew that call, he ought to know future contingent things. Quote, all things are naked and open unto his eyes, Hebrews 4:13. If all things, therefore the thoughts and voluntary actions of men, and existing not only in act, but also future, which God sees not only in their causes, but also in his decree. Hence he is said to understand our thoughts afar off, and to know our downsittings and uprisings. For there is not a word in my tongue, but thou knowest it altogether. Psalm 139, 1-4. Therefore not only actually existing, but also future. Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. Jeremiah 1:5. I knew that thou wouldest deal very treacherously. Isaiah 48:8. I know the things that come into your mind, every one of them. Ezekiel 11:5. 2. Because God predicts future contingent things. Therefore he knows them. For unless he infallibly knows, he could not certainly predict them, as he frequently does. Quote, the knowledge of God has as many witnesses as he has made prophets. Tertullian against Marcion. Quote, he declares the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done. Isaiah 46:10. Show the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know that ye are gods. Isaiah 41:23. God thus distinguishes himself from false gods and creatures. The examples of prediction occur everywhere in the Scriptures. What do our adversaries reply here? That these predictions are of probabilities only, as they impiously speak. But who can stand the blasphemous expression that the infallible knowledge of God is merely conjectural, and his word, which is stronger than heaven and earth, and of which not even an iota can pass away until all be fulfilled, is founded upon mere fallible probabilities, that these predictions are of things which God had decreed to bring about? But there is no future thing which God has not decreed, either to do if good, or to permit if bad, nor can he foreknow unless he has decreed them. That they are rather admonitions than predictions, but the passages themselves prove the contrary. For prediction is simply the narration of a future thing, but an admonition is a persuasion to a work of virtue or a dissuasion from the contrary. For some predictions can lead to the persuasion of men, it does not follow that they are not predictions. That this is said only of certain future things, not of all. But why should it be said of some and not of all? No reason can be assigned for the diversity. 3. Because the most perfect nature of God demands it. For if the knowledge of future things is a perfection in creatures, much more will it be so in God. Again, because he is omniscient, which he would not be unless his knowledge extended to all things, not only past and present, but also future, contingent as well as necessary. A. Because he is the searcher of the hearts, which would not be true if he did not most intimately know not only the thoughts, purposes, and affections of the heart, but also the propensities and dispositions before their actual execution. Jeremiah 17:9-10, Job 34:21, John 2:24-25, Acts 1:24, and Revelation 2:23. B. Because he is omnipresent, everywhere and intimately present with all his creatures, and moving and directing them before they move or direct themselves. 4. The decree of providence draws this necessarily after it, because as whatever takes place in time, God immutably decreed, either to effect or to permit. So he ought infallibly to foreknow it all. The reason is that the foreknowledge of God follows his decree, and as the decree cannot be changed, so neither can his knowledge be deceived. Our God is in the heavens. He has done whatsoever he pleased. Psalm 115:3. For of him and through him and to him are all things. Romans 11:36. He worketh all things after the counsel of his own will. Ephesians 1:11. Nor can these passages be referred only to the things which God himself does, and not to those which ought to be done by men, as placed in their will, as Socinus maintains. For all things alike are subject to divine providence, nor does the liberty of human actions hinder them from falling under his knowledge and decree, as will be proved hereafter. Sources of explanation. Although it is difficult to comprehend the mode in which God certainly knows future contingent things, yet the thing itself, confirmed by so many passages of Scripture and reasons, is not therefore to be denied. The principal foundation of the divine knowledge about future contingent things is not either the nature of second causes, which is supposed to be indifferent heterophorous, or simply the divine essence as immutable by creatures and as capable of producing them because it is the foundation of the possibility of things, the decree alone by which things pass from a state of possibility to a state of futurition, in which he sees them as it were determined and certainly future. And because the decree of God is not occupied about the thing, but also about the mode of the thing, i.e., that the thing may take place according to the nature of its cause, necessary if necessary, freely if free, God sees them in the decree not only as certainly future, but also as certainly future contingently. Of whatever things there is not a determinate truth, of them there cannot be a certain and infallible knowledge, if they are absolutely and in every respect indeterminate. But future contingent things are not such, for if they are indeterminate with respect to the second cause and in themselves, they are not so as to the first cause which decreed their futurition. If their truth is indeterminate with respect to us, who cannot see in which direction the free second cause is about to incline itself, it is not so with respect to God, to whom all future things appear as present. It is not inconsistent for the same thing to be said to be possible and impossible at the same time, but as to different things, possible with respect to potency or to the second cause, considered in itself and in a divided sense, and impossible relatively on the hypothesis of the divine decree and foreknowledge. So it is possible for Christ not to be crucified if God had so willed, and impossible on account of the decree. What therefore in the compound sense and on the supposition of the decree of God concerning the futurition of the thing was impossible not to take place, yet in the divided sense and the decree being laid aside was possible not to take place. It is one thing for a thing to be able to be done or not to be done, i.e., for a thing to be possible or not to be future hypothetically, another for a thing to be able to be at the same time future and not future. The former denotes only the temporal identity of power as much as the thing could be done or not. The latter implies the power of temporal identity because it is supposed that something could at the same time be and not be. Contingency applies to the former method, not to the second, which is absurd. We acknowledge a contradiction in these two propositions. The man is about to walk, and he is not about to walk, but not in these. The man is about to walk, and he is able not to walk. The first speaks of the truth of futurition, the latter of the truth of possibility. There's no repugnancy between these two propositions, and they can be true at the same time. Adam is certainly about to fall, and Adam is able not to fall. The former speaks of futurition of a thing from the decree, the latter of the possibility of a thing from the disposition of the second cause. The infallibility and certainty of the event does not take away the nature of the contingency of things, because things can happen necessarily as to the event, and yet contingently as to the mode of production. If there is granted a prescience of future contingent things, all things would take place necessarily by necessity of consequence, by the necessity of infallibility, not by necessity of the consequent and absolute. Therefore, there remains always this distinction between necessary and contingent things. The former have an intrinsic necessity because they arise from necessary proximate causes and are such in themselves, while the contingent, although having an extrinsic necessity by reason of the event, yet in their nature take place by contingent causes. The freedom of the will is indeed overthrown by a physical and coactive necessity, which is at variance with the formal reason of liberty, but not by a hypothetical necessity and of the infallibility of the event. For the same thing in this respect can be both free and necessary. Hence, although men's actions may be free, because done spontaneously and by a previous judgment of reason, they do not cease to be necessary with respect to the divine decree and foreknowledge. Now, the foreknowledge of God implies indeed the infallibility of futurition and of the event and the necessity of consequence, and yet does not imply coaction or violence, nor take away from the will and its intrinsic liberty. The infallible foreknowledge of God does not imply that God is the cause of sins, because God foreknows sins as certainly about to be, for example, the selling of Joseph and the betrayal of Christ, not as if they were to be affected by him as sins, but to be permitted and yet regulated by him. This mode makes him no more guilty in his foreknowledge and decree than in the execution, because neither the decree nor the foreknowledge subject the man to an intrinsic necessity, but only to an extrinsic as to the event. God does not make trial of man from ignorance, in this way to gain knowledge which he was not possessed of before, but from his most wise providence in order to declare to others what was before unknown to them. Thus he tried Abraham, not in order that he might know his faith and obedience by this experiment, which he was previously ignorant of, since even before he professed that he knew his piety, Genesis 18:19, but in order to make known to the world and the church his remarkable faith. If it is said that God then knew that he feared him, quote, "Now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thine only son from me," Genesis 22:12, this is not to be understood absolutely of the knowledge which God obtained, but transitively of the knowledge which he gave to others, as similar words are often used in the Scriptures. Although God testifies that he willed to go down and see whether the cry of Sodom which came to him was true, Genesis 18:21, it does not follow that he was ignorant of the nature and degree of the impiety of that city before. He had already said, quote, "The cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great," quote. But this is said after the manner of men, anthropopathos, to intimate that he performs the part of a good and exact judge, and neither pronounces nor executes anything rashly, as an accurate judge inquires on the spot into the thing itself, to avoid precipitate action. God is said to expect grapes from a vineyard, Isaiah 5:4, not because he was ignorant of what would happen, but this is spoken after the manner of men, because he seriously charged the people to be studious of good works, and such was the nature of the gifts bestowed, that he was as much bound to expect fruit from them, unless they had fallen upon ungrateful soil, as the industrious husbandman is accustomed to look for fruit from a vineyard properly cultivated. When God conceives future contingent things as certainly future, he does not conceive of them otherwise than they are, but he knows them relatively to the decree as necessarily about to take place, and determinate, which, relative to their cause, he knows as indeterminate and contingently future. Therefore God foreknows them both in himself and in his decree as the first cause, and so they are necessary on account of the immutability of the decree and the infallibility of foreknowledge. And God foreknows them in the second causes, on which they proximately and immediately depend, which are per se indefinite, and so they are contingent things.